Hi and welcome to part 2 of a video I did recently about this Packard Bell Club 40B computer. So in the last video I had a good look at all the hardware and software that it came with. I'll put a link in the description if anybody wants to watch that. But today it's going to be about the processor performance and see if you can get much gaming action out of it. So the machine has an SIS based motherboard. It's a BioStar M5 SIB running on the SIS 5598 Jedi chipset, and we've done a few little upgrades. So the initial processor that's in this machine is this Cyrix MII 300GP, and we're going to see how that performs in games and maybe compare it with alternatives, and then we're going to upgrade some of the other hardware. So this thing initially has a crappy SIS onboard graphics chip. We're going to disable that, add in a Matrox Mystique, and then also a Voodoo 2. It came with 32 megs of RAM. We're going to up that to 96 and see how it goes. So for testing this, it's not going to be an in-depth test because this was initially supposed to be on the end of the last video, except the last video went on a lot longer than I thought it was going to do. So broke it out into a separate video, and we're going to test 3D Mark 99, Quake, Quake 2, 3D Bench, Chris's 3D Benchmark, and also PC Player. So that's just to give, it's the CPU basically I want to look at rather than the graphics card, but adding the graphics card in is clearly going to make a difference, so it'll be interesting to see what that does. And also I wanted to do something that was FPU intensive because this chip is notorious for having a weak floating point unit, and Quake was supposed to be the game that killed this chip, so we'll find out shortly. And Quake 2 I've done as well, just to give it a real push. At the end of the testing I wanted to see if this machine could be potentially used as my main kind of early Windows 98 and DOS gaming rig, so I'm going to see how I can possibly throttle it down and see how it performs in some old speed sensitive games like Wing Commander. So the M2 processor, and a shiny golden thing it is too. It was the main reason why I bought this computer, because I always kind of wanted one of these. I always kind of like the underdogs. I never had anything like from AMD or Cyrix back in the day, so I was quite pleased to get this, and it was the main reason why I bought this computer. The M2 was the last chip produced under Cyrix's name, I believe, though I think the Media GX was sold off to somebody else, and I think that ultimately ended up in the hands of AMD, and they used some of the Media GX architecture in the Geode, which they only stopped manufacturing 2018, so the Geode was probably the last little bit of Cyrix's DNA, though the M2 was the last chip actually marketed under their name. But the long and tawdry story that leads us to the M2 probably starts with the 486, the Cyrix version of the 486, which they produced, and it was, I think, a sort of budget entry chip that undercut Intel. Intel actually tried to take them to court, I think, but I don't know what shenanigans went on with out-of-court settlements, but Cyrix were allowed to continue to produce x86 processors. So Socket 3, at the time that the Pentium came out, and it was quite a sort of high-cost entry into that world of P5 architecture, Cyrix saw a gap in the market and came up with 5x86, which I believe was a cut-down version of the 6x86 architecture, so they must have been cooking that away in the background. But they saw this opportunity to create something with sort of P5 Pentium kind of performance without upgrading your motherboard. So these became the fastest processors that would run in Socket 3, and I think they came out in 100 megahertz, 120 megahertz, and there's also a very rare, I believe, 133 megahertz version. But they quickly realized that this was a stopgap, so I don't think the 5x86 sold for very long, and then they came out with a full-blown 6x86 architecture which used Socket 7, and initially they didn't implement the full Pentium instruction set, so they start to run into problems when all of the software people started writing optimized code for P5 architecture, and that caused some problems with the early versions of the 6x86. I think they were codenamed M1. I don't know if they kept that later on, but they quickly upgraded the 6x86 line to have improved support for the Pentium instruction set and also the Pentium Pro, and thereafter they did pretty well, and they had a chip that would, you know, give the Pentium a real run for its money, competing at the sort of earlier speeds of like 133 and 166. And they were probably just lucky at that time, because I think most games and things like that really relied on integer maths more than floating point, and that is kind of something that began to be a problem with them a little bit later on, which is primarily what we're going to look at today with this chip. And probably the root of that problem was back into the 486, where the floating point unit that Cyrix had for the 486, I might be wrong here, but from what I've read, was a thing called fast math, and it was a kind of 387 class coprocessor, and that was very fast and outperformed Intel, and it also outperformed even some of the 486 floating point units. So Cyrix, probably been very proud of that and probably a little bit complacent, decided to just modify it slightly and bring it forward into the new line of chips. So I believe that came through the whole channel and went through the 5x86, went through the 6x86, and I believe it probably ended up in the M2 in some form as well. So they did that kind of lazy instead of designing a complete new floating point unit for the new world of the Pentium. Also, the 6x86, where you get into this crazy thing where they break away from the true speed of the processor. So they started using these PR things because their chips performed well against the Pentium, so they started rating it higher. So you get a chip that would run at 100 megahertz, and they would give it a PR 120 rating, basically saying this thing will kick the ass of a Pentium 120. And it probably was true at that time when everything used integer-based maths, but it was a silly idea. I think AMD did it as well, and it was just confusing and stupid. The first chips that were M2 architecture, so not all of them were branded M2s. So the earlier ones were the late 6x86s up to the PR266. Basically, these are all chips that now had the MMX instruction set. So you're looking at the PR166, PR200, PR233, and the PR266 were all M2s, but still branded as 6x86s on the chip themselves. And then, when we get to this one, the 300, they changed the branding to M2. Why would they do that? Because Socket 7 was no longer a viable platform, and everybody was getting into slots in the Pentium 2. And Cyrix again saw this window of opportunity that they had done with Socket 3 to extend the life of the Socket 7 platform, and then they started making processors that still use Socket 7 but were aimed squarely at competing with the Pentium 2, so hence they started stamping the big number 2 on their processors to make sure you knew that. So this chip came out in early 1998, and of course a year and a half before that, in summer 1996, a game called Quake had come out into the market, which kind of shook things up quite a lot. Everybody wanted to play it. It became the new benchmark for everything. I believe John Carmack of id Software had created some kind of overlapping floating point and integer maths within the P5 architecture, and Cyrix just couldn't handle that. And I believe AMD also struggled with that kind of thing as well. So by the time we get to when this M2 chip came out, it was well established that their days of boasting about gaming performance were probably over, though it says nothing on this chip about, you know, not being anything other than something that could compete with the Pentium 2 300. That's the impression it gives, though some of it is lies by this point. The M2's also dabbling in the same kind of thing that Cyrix did with the Socket 3. They are trying to push a processor on an old platform and claim that it's kind of the equivalent of a next-gen thing. So everyone's moving on to slot 1 and their Pentium 2s, and I imagine there's a fair few people who might have bought this thinking they were getting a bargain of something that would work as well as a Pentium 2, and then loading up Quake or Quake 2 and finding out quite the opposite. Cyrix tried to compensate for that lack of FPU performance by trying to massively increase their cache. So this thing has 64 kilobytes of level 1 cache, and it also has a smaller code cache that could be switched over to help out with sort of multimedia type stuff, but too little too late. So I think this was the first of the branded M2 processors. There were a few afterwards that went all the way up to the M2 433, but that was it. That was the end of Cyrix, at least as a brand. It was a bit of a shame. So plan A was, because this thing's got a M2 300 in it and it claims to compete with the 300 MHz Pentium, I dug out my Dell Dimension 300 MHz Pentium and was going to compare it with that. This machine also contains a Voodoo 2, a 12 megabyte Voodoo 2, which is what I've just put into the Packard Bell. But I quickly changed my mind. So the first thing I did before I actually got round to doing that was run 3D Mark 99 with the M2 as it stands. So we did a bench in 3D Mark 99. I pushed it a little bit. We used the Voodoo card as the graphics processor and run it at 800 by 600 at 16-bit color. And apologies for the slightly cubic resolution I seem to have chosen when I did my screen capture. I'm not quite sure what happened there. Muddled up my canvas sizes and my resolution perhaps. Anyway, since we're not actually really looking at the game, it doesn't matter. But you can see straight away there that the frame rates we're getting out of here are terrible. So yeah, 10-11 frames a second there. And at this point I decided that it probably was not going to be worth benching it against that Pentium 2 300 and decided to look for something that the M2 might have a little bit more luck against, and came up with this. So a 233 Pentium might have been the ideal thing to compare it with, given the M2 runs at an actual speed of 233 itself, but I don't have one, so the closest thing I've got is Pentium 200s, and we've got two flavors here. We've got the Pentium 200 and the Pentium 200MMX. So they're slightly slower in terms of clock speed than the M2, and also their cache is considerably reduced. So we've got the 64 kilobytes of level 1 cache on the M2. The Pentium 200 only has 8 kilobytes, and the Pentium 200MMX has 16 kilobytes. So it'll be very interesting to see how they all compare. Off we go, set it all up. 800 by 600 16-bit with the Voodoo 2 as the graphics card. So these processors all differ slightly in that the M2 runs at 75 megahertz bus, the two Pentiums run at 66. I should also have said that the M2 had a problem with heat. They were very, very hot chips, so there was a low voltage version of this made. This one runs at 2.9 volts. I think there was a 2.2 volt one that runs cooler that is quite rare. And the results are in. So the scores are in, and it doesn't look good for the M2. I did wonder whether I had an issue with the speed of my M2, but then it can only be the processor because the other chips are running okay, it seems, and beating the M2 quite substantially. So 3D Mark wise, we got 852 for the M2, 973 for the Pentium 200, and 1066 for the Pentium 200MMX. But it's really the CPU mark bit that I was looking at. So for CPU marks, the M2 gets 1078. The Pentium 200 gets 1379, so it's quite a jump, and the Pentium 200MMX gets 1464. So you're looking at 400 CPU marks faster for the Pentium 200MMX. That doesn't look good if it's right. I mean, there could be something wrong with my chip, but we'll get a bit more into that because I did compare it with some other benchmarks to try and disprove that. So next up, from Phil's Computer Labs DOS benchmark, we're looking at 3D Bench, and again you can see the Pentiums are fairly close together, but both of them substantially thrash the M2 300. So I don't know if these things use a lot of floating point. They probably might do, but yeah, there you go. So onto Chris's 3D benchmark. Now, looking at a video that Phil's Computer Labs did a while ago, Phil used these benchmarks to benchmark this processor, and I wasn't sure whether he was using the low-res version or the high-res version, because for some of these benches there is a one that I guess runs at 320 by 200, and then there's a VGA one that runs at 640 by 480, but my scores seem to fairly well match his at the lower resolution, so I'm going to assume that for now. But here you actually see the M2 beats the Pentiums at the lower resolution version, but when you get up to 640 by 480, the two Pentiums pull away quite substantially. So yeah, I'd say overall that's another lose for the M2. So finally, for the DOS benching suite, we look at the PC Player benchmark, and again this comes in two flavors, the 320 by 200 and the 640 by 480. And yeah, the M2 again beats out the Pentiums at the lower resolution, and they're all neck and neck at the higher resolution. So I guess you can see between these benchmarks the differences between which ones use more integer maths and which ones use more floating point. But certainly in these older ones, where the sort of 6x86 and the 5x86 would have done well, I guess are probably more integer based, and the M2 holds its own against the Pentiums. It wasn't Phil's 3D benchmark suite that was the Achilles heel of the Cyrix, it was Quake. So we're going to bench Quake and Quake 2 now and see how they go. We're going to bench each of them at 320 by 200 in software, and then again at 640 by 480 in software, and then we'll do them both at 640 by 480 using the 12 megabyte Voodoo 2. So first of all, looking at the results for Quake 1, you're getting sort of playable frame rates in software at 320 by 200 for all of them. Now this is, I was expecting to get around about 40 frames a second for the M2, but I was only getting 28.1. For the P200 I was getting 31.9, and for the Pentium 200MMX 34.2. So I'd say that they were all a little bit slow, but all kind of playable at 320 by 200 in software. As soon as you step up to 640 by 480, it just becomes unplayable, so you're not even getting into double figures for any of those processors. But as soon as you plug the Voodoo card in, it's a whole different ball game. All of them with the Voodoo 2 are getting around 40 frames a second at 640 by 480. So if you had the money to invest in a decent 3D card, then any of these processors would have done. But in software, I would say probably the only one you're going to get a reasonably decent experience at. I mean, the Pentium 200 was getting just over 30, so I'd say that's probably okay. The M2 was getting sort of 3 or 4 frames behind that, under 30, so probably not great. But the Pentium 200MMX at 320 by 200 in software was playable 34.2. Though like I said, I think they're a little bit down on what I was expecting to get. I think it was Thandor.net I looked, and he was running it in software at 320 by 200, and they were getting just under 40 frames a second. So it seems to be a little bit slow, possibly 10 frames a second down. I'm wondering if there is something wrong on this motherboard, whether the level 2 cache isn't working quite as it should do or something like that. Benching on Quake 2 was more a bit of fun than anything, just to see if you could get anything out of it. So yeah, the M2 wouldn't run at all at 320 by 240. That would be the resolution that you would have thought it would run at, but it just wouldn't start. Then thereafter it's pretty dismal, 640 by 480 single figures, and even with the Voodoo 2 you were getting up to 18 frames a second. The Pentium 200 ran at 16 frames a second for 320 by 240, 640 by 480, 8, and you were only getting up to 22, 23 frames a second even with the Voodoo card. The Pentium 200MMX did a little bit better. It was 34.2 frames a second I was getting out of that, and that was 320 by 240 in software, so I guess that was playable at the lower resolution. I'm not sure why that was so much higher than the Pentium 200. Back down to single figures for 640 by 480. 640 by 480 with the Voodoo card and the Pentium 200MMX, you were kind of approaching playable, bad playable levels. We got it up to just under 27 frames a second. So that pretty much wraps it up. There you have it. It's not by any means a performing machine. It's not really a gamer. Even with the Pentium MMX 200 in it, it would probably be okay for sort of a early Windows 98, late DOS machine. I don't know, but a bit disappointed with it performance-wise. But I'm glad to have the Cyrix in my collection, and it's a nice little machine. I'm glad to have the machine in my collection as well, though I can't see it getting a lot of use, to be honest. I'll get it out every now and then, have a bit of a play around with it, but it's just nice to save it from the scrap heap. Nice beige box. It's even got a little window there. I guess this case must have been used in earlier models because it's got a window that looks like it might have had a megahertz display behind it. But yeah, pleased to have it. This whole video, this experience of 2 parts has taken a lot longer than I thought it was going to, but I've enjoyed looking at the machine, and I hope you've enjoyed watching. And yeah, I hope those benchmarks made sense. If anybody knows anything more about the performance of this machine, because I'm still not quite sure that it's working as fast as it should do, but whatever. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me for the next video. Bye.